how are you doing with everything?
I'm doing well with everything. I'm just concerned about the chaos in the city and the fact that we need to do something to get a grip on this. Uh, I'm concerned about things spiraling out of control, about our tentative political situation, um, and that I really do not want to allow forces that don't have the interests of this community at heart to sabotage it.
What do you mean by forces?
I'm talking about the November election coming up with Donald Trump and his law and order agenda. That's my concern. And if we, I think with protest, there is a value in them, and they lift up the cause of righteousness. And in this case, highlighting the death of Mr. Prude, that he died at the hands of the police, which he did do, and there's some concern there. But at the same time, we need to look at encouraging people to turn out to vote, and as long as there's an element that's causing disruption and everything, it plays into the president's hands. That's what I'm saying.
When I hear them talk, some of them talk about this generational divide within the black community, and they might say, what you've done, the words that have come out of the elders, so to speak, have been righteous and well meant, but they want action now.
Right, right. And I think that's the story of youth. I remember in ancient times when I was young, and we all wanted action, and we all wanted things now. Not realizing as a young person that it takes time to cross from A to point Z, and that you're going to get these incremental successes along the way, and you just don't get it all at once. In essence, I think the young people have won, but it's not only the young people, but even people my age supported the fact that there needs to be more of a unsealing of what took place relative to Mr. Prude's death, why that was not made public for 5 to 6 months, and needing justice. And I mean, everybody is behind that. People want to stop the killings and the mayhem by police reaction to black people. You know, there's no doubt about it. We all want the same thing. I think we all have the same goal in mind, which is a non-racist society, which is freedom. I think the issue comes in the tactics in terms of how do you get there. I came up during the civil rights generation, and that was a generation of protest also. There's nothing wrong with that. But the fact is, when do you halt the protests and then come to the table to sit down to negotiate, which might involve some compromise, but you're going to negotiate anyway? I think that's the issue. I think the fact that with our Black Lives Matter group here, I think these are great young people. These are laudable young people. They have a lot of passion. They have a lot of energy. But I think that they have won. The issue has been won. And what I mean by the issue has been won is the fact that they've highlighted the issue of what happened by members of the RPD. And so the question is, what do we do now? Well, what we do now is press for charges to be leveled against them and their prosecution. I think the AG is already going to impanel a grand jury to look at this situation. So that has been won. But there are two other things that need to be done. How do you transform law enforcement? How do you re-envision law enforcement? And I think the other thing that we see in this case, and in the case of another gentleman, I think of Mr. Davis, who was tasered and killed several years ago, who also had mental health issues, and his death was also ruled a homicide by the coroner, just as Mr. Prude's case. is how do we put more mental health professionals out on the streets, basically, and to deal with this situation.
You talk about incremental change. From the civil rights movement until now, have you noticed incremental change when it comes to policing and police community relations in Rochester?
Well, what happened is I see the police because I've been working with this situation a long time. We've had, we meaning UCLM has had 4 community police summits. And in those summits, we dealt with, our guideline was President Barack Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing. And there are several pillars, about 6 in there. And the only pillar that we were able to address and get to for quite some time is the first pillar, which is building trust and legitimacy. And the reason why is because the fact that the police were so entrenched in their particular perspectives relative to law enforcement, and they only see things through the lens of law enforcement and not through the victims of police misconduct or repression in that sense. I mean, this was my whole issue that I felt problematic with the police protection proposals that were espoused by the New York State Sheriff's Association. Everything, all the proposals on that were increased by felonies and this and that, which would have made an undue, harsh burden on communities of color. And so law enforcement really needs to perceive how their policies and how their procedures impact negatively people who are trying to deal with issues and who are trying to survive.
Mm-hmm. So what improvements have you seen over the years leading up to this point?
Well, I've seen the fact that, number one, they were willing to sit at the table and dialogue with us, because I think that's the first step. Number two, the mayor had signed an MOU relative to creating UCLM's Community Justice Advisory Board. And that Community Justice Advisory Board, for us, was to sit down with RPD on a quarterly basis, or as often as possible, to look at their utilization of body-worn cameras. And not only their utilization, but also the policies behind them. What we found out is that some officers were deliberately not turning on their cameras. And so we asked Chief Singletary and the former Chief Simonelli, how are you dealing with this? Are there any disciplinary measures that you are going to impose relative to police officers not turning on their cameras? And so we had got to that point. However, my concern is that here we are from March on, sitting around the table discussing community police relations, right? And yet there are officers who were complicit in Mr. Prude's death, and we did not even know anything about it. And so we're talking about transparency and accountability, but there was no transparency. So in a sense, there was a curtain that was dropped that the public could not penetrate. And therefore, for me, it was hypocrisy. And so we can only go so far based upon their terms. And I'm saying that, well, this has to be a two-way street now. If we're going to have accountability and transparency, then you must stop, as law enforcement officers, hiding things from the public and be open and honest about it so we can work through these things. It's all about justice, but it's not about you hiding the shenanigans or the dirt that's going on in your police departments.
There's proposals out there to completely reform the police department, perhaps even taking away officers who respond to normal calls with guns and things like that, and maybe just having emergency units or mental health units that respond to various specific incidents. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that is a helpful and therapeutic move forward in terms of policy. I've known of several cases where when you get officers in those situations, they tend to escalate situations instead of de-escalating. And what we need is, I think police officers are expected to be everything, social workers, this and that, and they're not that. They're supposed to be servants, protectors of the community. They're supposed to be guardians and not warriors of the community. They're not supposed to make things worse. They're supposed to make things better. So we need more what we call mental health professionals on the ground to deal with these situations. Now, in some situations relative to domestic violence, there is going to be, at some point, a need to call the police to intervene where you have some impending violence or where violence is. But on most of these situations, where people are dealing with mental health issues, I support the fact that we need more mental health practitioners doing that type of intervention and therapeutic work. In fact, that's one of UCLM's proposals that we have proposed to this Commission on Race.
We've been talking about the issues coming from the Black Lives Matter perspective. I hear from another crowd that comes at it from the perspective of officers, saying a lot of them got into it to serve, and the streets are very violent, and there's risk involved and spontaneous decisions that can lead to poor outcomes. What's your take on those who look at the protests or look at those positions saying they're not appreciating the officers, in their words, sacrifice?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what the protesters, number one, are looking at on one side is the constant, continued pattern of police abuse and misconduct, which has been taking place for decades. A black person at one point could not ride through a Rondequoit without being racially profiled and stopped for no reason at all, just merely because they were black. And people see that. They see issues with Breonna Taylor and Tamir Rice and others, and George Floyd. They see this, they become angry, they become outraged because you see the pattern of abuse. The one thing I found out about cops is a lot of them, they just don't get it. They just don't understand. And they said that they need training and things of that sort, but yet there's that code, that blue code of silence in which they begin to support and reinforce each other because it becomes a bunker mentality. And I think that in order for them to really serve their community, they're going to have to open up their minds more, get rid of these bunker mentalities and attitudes that they have, and really look at what's going on in the community. You see, one of the concerns that I have with our community summits is that we did not get the opportunity to face off and dialogue with patrol officers, regular people on the street, on the beat, that we needed to talk to find out what was going on. And so that's why we are proposing a couple things. Number one, a racial justice and education training curriculum at the police academy for all law enforcement agencies in Monroe County and hopefully the state. Because right now, currently, they have a curriculum which includes sexual harassment, diversity, and implicit bias under one label. And for new recruits coming in, you only get 4 hours of that. Well, come on, let's expand that to about 40 to 60 hours. Because if we're really going to plumb the depths of police attitudes and how do we change things, then we just can't do it in a cursory curriculum that is about 4 hours long and that's it. Nobody's going to gain anything from that. The other thing that we are proposing is that we put in place a citizens public safety interview panel, which means that all those officers, or let's say pre-officers, who are applying as applicants for the police academy and as police candidates, be interviewed by citizens. And the citizens would be trained in how they would interview these candidates. And furthermore, the citizens would give a high recommendation or a no recommendation as to whether they should be accepted as candidates for the police department. And so those would be some great innovative changes that UCLM is pushing for and that we want to see as part of a package of police reforms.
You talk about UCLM, it reminds me that religion has played a large role in your position, in your advocacy over the years.
Yes, religion has, because I come from a family of ministers. My father was a minister. My uncles and my cousins and my brothers, all ministers. But I really began to put it together when I went to seminary here at Colgate back in the early 70s. And Dr. King and ministers that were involved in the civil rights movement in seeing the connection between the biblical mandate, which is a scripture in Micah says to love mercy and to love justice and to walk humbly before thy God. And that justice rings very true for me, so that in terms of our protests, even during the civil rights movement and on and up, because not only was I involved in the civil rights movement, not only was I at the 1963 March on Washington, not only did I protest the Vietnam War and things of that sort, so I've been involved in matters of protest, in forms of protest, historically for decades. When Reverend Graves was alive, I don't know if you remember Reverend Graves. He was president of the United Church Ministry at that time and had taken on issues relative to community police conflicts even back then. So faith, matters of religion and justice have held a very real importance and high value for me because of the interrelationship between justice, freedom, and the biblical mandate of the prophets in the Bible and in terms of the issues that we're confronting now in our community.
I think a lot of people look at the current struggle and they don't see a way out. I think there's a lot of hopelessness out there. Mm-hmm. People just thinking this is the way it's going to be for a long time. Do you see it that way, or do you see this eventually solving itself?
Well, I see it eventually solving itself, but through great struggle. No battle for freedom comes easy. It's not a cakewalk. Sometime, as the great John Lewis said, it's a lifetime of struggle, and that's what it is. But I look at where my ancestors came from slavery, the boats, to sharecropping in that sense, a form of feudalism, to up to this present time. There has been progress. There has been progress. But now what we've got to do is look at the demographics in the city and how do we change these issues relative to entrenched poverty, income inequality, inadequate education, not having universal affordable health care. These are all the great issues of our times. And this COVID-19 certainly has killed and made sick a lot of people also in the black and brown communities. So there are greater issues than just police community relations. But all of these issues are interrelated relative to systemic and institutional racism and the changes that that must be done. So that any kind of change, it takes heart, it takes patience, it takes long suffering, but at the same time, it takes great struggle. And you must have the will and the heart to stick there and to not give up. I'm 74 years old, my friend, and I've been doing this for a long time because I can see down at the end of the road that if we keep on struggling and hang in there, we can transform our community and we can certainly transform American society. But that's going to depend on those of us who are soldiers in the struggle for justice and righteousness. And remember I'm a person that adheres to the principles of nonviolence with Dr. King and Gandhi. And only with nonviolent principles can change be brought about.
the confrontation that happened a few days ago between the group that was speaking, I believe it was here.
Yeah, the group that was at the community forum that UCLM had, and I was surprised at that because I was concerned about the fact that in order to have dialogue, you must bring the principals or the persons that you are antagonistic to, bring them there, invite them to the community forum, have the audience there to ask them questions and to hold their feet to the fire. Let's be open about this. And this group, they came through. They really tried to hijack our program. Did not really want us to go forward with the agenda, which really surprised me, because how are you going to get the questions or the answers that you want yourself and not allow people to speak? And for me, it showed the fact that that there wasn't that respect for dialogue, for question and answer that really needs to be done. You can't have a particular party line in which you want people to say things your own way without listening to others also, even that particular point of view. We have a lot of people in this community, older people like myself and even younger, who want peace, but they want peace also with justice. But they are right now, they want the protests to move forward if it's about justice, but at the same time they want to move forward with their lives. They want to get back to stability. And I think everyone wants to get back to stability with this COVID-19 virus pandemic. The issue is, how do we do that? And I've tried to tell the young people that that many of the people in our community, they want police protection because it's necessary with the gun violence in our community. And so I think the issue for us is, how do we transform and re-envision the police department so that basically they're serving the true needs of people?